back from the break, and we're going to continue to the second lecture, the second part of today's workshop about the longitudinal study
All right.
of child maltreatment.
So I have to confess that I didn't prepare this one ahead of time, but so I pulled up a talk from my computer that I gave last summer when I was still at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So I'm now at the University of Colorado. Moving later in life from one university to another is an interesting experience. We can talk about that someday as a different kind of longitudinal experience and study. So I'm going to talk about LONGSCAN. The first lesson for from LONGSCAN is if you decide to do a longitudinal study for 20 years, that means you're going to be spending most of your life doing this study and living with it every day, and you kind of not get away from it. So just be careful that you really like the study you're getting involved in. It's one piece of advice. And I'm going to talk about, I'll give a little bit of overview of LONGSCAN itself and what we're doing with it. And then one of the questions that, as a clinician, I hear all the time people expressing their opinions, that sexual abuse is the worst thing that can happen to a child, or emotional abuse is the worst thing that can happen to a child. And I got involved in analyzing our data to try and see the relative contributions of different forms of violence in terms of how they compare. It's not like you choose one versus the other, but it's useful because I have colleagues who just have such strong feelings about one form of maltreatment or another and just feel so strongly about it. And I thought, well, let's see what the data tell us about kind of what's important. And what's intriguing to me about it is it really challenges kind of how I practice pediatrics and how I respond clinically in child abuse cases, because to give a long story, to make a short piece of it, it turns out exposure to domestic violence for young children may be far more important than either physical abuse or sexual abuse. And that poses some real problems because the child protection system often kind of jumps on a woman who's already a victim of domestic violence and it threatens to take her kids away because she's allowed them to say her being beaten, and suddenly she's neglectful of the children and at risk for losing children. And so I've often been kind of protective that we shouldn't be doing that and making lives of women worse. And yet the data suggests that the children witnessing domestic violence for young children may be far more important. So that's the dilemma that this project's involved in. So LONGSCAN is an acronym for Longitudinal Studies in Child Abuse and Neglect. And just take a step back, in 1974, the U.S. Congress created a National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect, which was doing research, had the mission of doing research on child abuse and neglect. It was placed in a social service agency, the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families in the federal government. And they gave out research dollars on child abuse and neglect. But they didn't give out, A, very many dollars, it was small dollars, and B, it was largely a child welfare agency and was not establishing core answers to questions related to medical aspects of child abuse and neglect. But at the same time, our National Institutes of Health had a policy that they didn't fund child abuse research. And so Congress in 1987 had a hearing and took this agency, about this agency, and the agency was kind of beat up in Congress about not having funded basic questions about child abuse and neglect and prognosis of children. And so they put out a call following that hearing for a national study on child abuse and neglect, which we applied for. And that's the origins of LONGSCAN. So we, actually maybe one more diversion. The question we came up with, the question that they asked for is they wanted somebody to design a study for them on the antecedents and consequences of child abuse and neglect. And the question was, well, what's the right sample? Do you use children at risk? Do you use children who've been reported? Do you use children who've been substantiated? Do you look at special populations like children who are in foster care? Or do you look at a population from a system outside of social services, such as a medical center sample? And we debated for close to a year as we designed the study as to what the right sample was, and finally came up with the answer, yes. All of the above. And so LONGSCAN has samples from each of those, and I'll describe in a minute. And so we have, I ran the coordinating center at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And then we had samples that came from 5 different places, and I'll describe them each in detail. But I just wanted to list my collaborators. Howard Dubowitz is somebody Asher knows that's been over to Israel a number of times, who's actually originally from South Africa and who's at the University of Maryland, runs the medical center sample. Jonathan Koch is a colleague in North Carolina who has a sample of children born at risk in North Carolina. Richard Thompson has a sample from the Juvenile Protective Association, which is a private nonprofit treatment agency in Chicago that takes care of children who've been substantiated and referred. Northwest, Diana English is a PhD in social work who coordinates a study there, which is children at the time of referral to social services. And Al Lichernick is a psychologist who's studying foster care in San Diego. And so those are our samples. So the overview, the planning grant was funded in 1989 as a result of Congress beating up on the agency. It was mandated by Congress. It was supposed to look at the antecedents and consequences. It's actually 5 distinct studies, but we share common measures as a consortium, common governance, common data protocols. We designed the study as to what it ought to look like collectively, and then said it takes 4 out of the 5 sites, or 4 out of the 6 investigators, myself included, to make changes. So we kind of set up so that it's kind of proceeding ahead, and if you want to derail it, it takes more than one site to derail it. So somebody couldn't pull out and say, we're not sharing our data. And there's a paper that we've actually published in a journal called Violence and Aggression that describes the study, and we have a website at the Injury Prevention Research Center at unc.edu/LONGSCAN that has all our measures and has access to papers and other things that we've written about LONGSCAN. We have about 180 papers that have been published on the data set. So we did a conceptual model. Hopefully I'll kind of go through the details because the text is a little small. The graph represents that we think children are going from young age to older age. Family environment's more important early on and less important later on, and we're looking at outcomes at a sets of points at 4, 6, 8, 12, 16, and we were going to do 20 on the slide. We actually moved to 18 for some methodologic reasons. We take a look at the maltreatment experiences that children have. We consider the child's characteristics, the family's characteristics, the parents' characteristics in terms of mental health and substance abuse. We look at social support and social networks. We're interested in the communities that the children are in and their connectedness to communities and the systems of care issues, and ultimately interested in child outcomes, both mental health and medical. And we're looking at each of the different times. So that's the overall conceptual model. So we have a sample. 1,354 kids were collected into LONGSCAN across 5 sites. Eastern site is a group of children who are at risk. And the way they were defined as at risk is a medical center was concerned about them because they were failure to thrive, HIV or drug exposed in utero, and there's actually a neighborhood control sample for that children in the city of Baltimore. So those children were defined kind of outside of the child welfare system as being at risk. In the South, Jonathan Koch and his colleagues had 243 children they had recruited into a cohort study. Originally, it was close to 700 children, but the funding for LONGSCAN was a lot smaller. We couldn't afford to do all 700. And so we picked all the children from the original sample collected at birth who had been reported to child maltreatment in the first 4 years of life. And then, so that was about 70, and matched them with another 140 kids who, 2 to 1 match, who had not been reported. So there's roughly 210, and then there's some replacements of kids that dropped out. So they have a total of 243 children, a third of which had been reported already in the first 4 years of life for abuse or neglect. The Northwest was, Diane English contributed a sample. She was interested in looking at in Seattle, in that state, they use a risk assessment instrument when social services gets a referral, and they classify them as high risk, moderate risk, or low risk. And she was interested in looking at the moderate risk group. And so these were children reported to social services and judged to be at moderate risk on initial screening before the investigation was done. And it turns out about 60% of them were so-called substantiated, and about 40% were not substantiated. So we have a comparison, a natural comparison in the Seattle side is the kids who were substantiated by the social welfare agency versus those not. And then the Midwest, In Chicago, the Juvenile Protective Association and similar treatment agencies take substantiated children and offer family services. And so we arranged for them to match their kids to kids who came into child welfare who weren't referred for treatment. And then, so those were 2/3 of the sample were either reported and substantiated and offered services, reported and substantiated and not offered services. And 1/3 of the sample were children who were neighborhood controls. And then finally, the Southwest, it turns out one of the reviewers for our original grant had a National Institutes of Health grant studying foster care. And he called up after we were funded and said, how about if I bring in my sample of foster children in the Southwest, and it won't cost you anything. And we're using the same measures, we'll just change the protocol so it looks like yours, and we'll roll them in the study. And so the children who were in foster care in the first 4 years of life from San Diego were enrolled in the study as well. So that's 100% of those children had been at foster care at one time. By age 4, half of them were already home. So we have the natural comparison there is children who were substantiated, taken out of the home and put back home versus children substantiated and staying out of the home. And then we did lots of interviews. And this is a busy slide. I just will point a couple things. We refer to something as baseline and have 1,354 kids. We have only 1,250 that we saw a child or caregiver at age 4. We had some children we saw before then that we re-recruited back in at age 6 that were new. And so there are 1,236 done at age 6, 1,250, but we said we'll take either one of those as the baseline interview. And so that turns out to be 1,354 children who had either an age 4 or an age 6 interview. And then we followed them over time, and actually this number is now a little over 900. I haven't updated the slide. So we have about 911 of the original 1,354 that were signed up. In terms of examination, they really haven't changed very much. We had a little bit less than half are males. Most of the sample was African American because it was a child welfare sample from big cities, and so it was predominantly African American. And the income, fortunately, over time has changed. So at 18, the median income was between $30,000 and $35,000, and the median education was high school for the parents. We described the sample by the Battelle screener as a child development screener. And at age 4, these are all the kids that we had at age 4 that we had the Battelle completed on. 51% were regarded as having serious developmental delay. Only 26 were normal. 10% were borderline. Another 13% thought to have a developmental problem. So it's a group that was needy, that was referred. It actually doesn't look very dissimilar from many child welfare samples. And then these are the characteristics by individual scale on the Battelle. So 58% of children had developmental delays. This is 1.5 standard deviations below the norm was the criteria we used. In social, 32% adaptive, about half in motor, and so total 64% actually had one or more of the subscales. So it's a group that looked actually worse at baseline than they look now, which is another interesting issue. They're actually, the follow-up is many of them are doing quite well. We used the Peabody to get Peabody picture vocabulary test to assess their cognitive development. 38% above were average, another 2% were moderately high, and 0.1% were extremely high in their development. Unfortunately, a quarter of the sample was extremely low, and 33% were moderately low. So a handicapped, developmentally delayed population of kids, which as it turns out looks like what the child welfare population overall in the country looks like, who gets referred. And then we use the child behavior checklist, and these are the data showing, what the green is clinical range. So about a little less than a quarter were in the clinical range on externalizing at age 4 and 6. Internalizing, which is not nearly as sensitive in terms of picking up depression because kids don't manifest it as easily. The 8% were in the clinical range, and the total problem score, about 1/5 of the children were in the clinical range.
How does
Well, this is pretty characteristic of a child welfare population. So we think we captured who it is that social welfare worries about. It's not obviously not a normal population. And then we looked at their functioning on the Vineland screener. And most of them were doing pretty well. This is adaptive functioning. 92% were doing okay at age 6 on adaptive functioning, and it declined a little bit at age 12. Socialization, 91%. So this, but at age 12, only 50% were okay on the Vineland. So so that was collectively that was the Vineland screener didn't show us a big deficits, except on the socialization at age here. Actually, this is the distribution. I'm sorry. This is the very low is green, moderately low is red, and you can see at age 12 socialization. It was actually a lot of kids were not doing terribly well in socialization at age 12 on the sample. So this is the sample we had. What's interesting about LONGSCAN is that the differences from the different samples disappeared over the life of the study. Because remember, the samples were defined by their first 4 years of life, and since then we know who's exposed to domestic violence, we know who's moved, we know who's in foster care, we know so much about that, because we do a 2-hour interview with the kids, or with the parents, and an hour interview with the children each of these times we see them. And so we've actually learned a lot more about them, and the things that we know about them, we can explain the variance more than where the original sample was, and what part of the country they came from. So they've become a more homogeneous cohort over time. They start off as 5 different cohorts. And we still, in our analysis, always try and control for sight and make sure that they're not baseline differences that distinguish it. But in truth, what's happening is that they've actually grown more and more alike, or at least we know so much more about them, and the things that have happened to them since age 4 are more determinative of their outcomes than what happened in the first 4 years of life. So how do we know who was maltreated? We had originally presumed we were going to use official exposures, but we got called out by our colleagues for that because they, as I talked about before with the survey research, I mean, we know that a lot more happens than what social services knows about. And, but we were concerned in a longitudinal study that if we asked the families directly, they would drop out of the study, refuse to participate, and we'd lose them. And so we were really nervous about the long-term consequences to LONGSCAN of directly asking the families about the maltreatment. And I recall being at a meeting with my peers at a professional meeting and basically being called chicken for not collecting more accurate data about who was exposed. And I responded to that by getting a grant to run a special meeting to ask the question, at what age and how do you directly ask children about maltreatment? And we called the ethical, legal, and methodologic questions about directly asking children about child maltreatment. We actually published this meeting in July 2000 Journal of Interpersonal Violence. And to raise the issue, when can children give informed consent to being asked about maltreatment? When are they old enough to disclose and potentially get their families in trouble or get the perpetrator prosecuted? I mean, how do you sort that out? We can basically concluded that probably not under 10, and probably 11 for normal kids, and maybe a little bit older for kids who aren't normal, and our kids weren't quite normal. So we ended up making a decision that we were going to ask our kids at age 12. The side effect for us, however, is that we'd already seen these children at age 4 and 6 and 8. And so by the time they got to 12, they knew our investigators. There were some mothers who referred to our interviewers as one of their major support. I mean, this is a person who saw them every 2 to 4 years. And when we asked them on a survey about who their support figures were, they named our interviewers on occasion. So it was a sad group of people, to tell you the truth. But that also meant that they probably trusted us disproportionately to the risk of directly being asked. I mean, because they knew us and had seen us. And so some interesting ethical discussions about how you start up asking people who've already been involved in a study about exposures to maltreatment that potentially put them at risk, and did they really understand and have informed consent? So we did a couple things we did, one of which is we decided to ask the children directly, but we also thought we'd honor the children's autonomy and respect for persons over the beneficence or the idea that we were going to come in and fix things. We were researchers, not clinicians in this context, and we decided that we were going to make clear that the advice to abused and neglected children and tell an adult that we would make explicit whether they were asking for help or not with us. And so we developed an audio Cassie interview, which they had earphones on. The questions for maltreatment were asked to them from the earphones, so nobody else in the room knew what questions they were answering. It wasn't on the screen. And they used a computer and used a mouse to indicate yes or no, or if it was a graded question, what the steps were. And so nobody who was looking at them would know what question they were answering or disclosing, so that there was completely protected from that standpoint. At the end of the interview, if they'd responded yes to some items on the abuse or neglect questions, we then said, you answered some questions that make us worried that things have happened to you that you should get help for. Would you like us to ask the interviewer to get you help? And so the person who was giving them the computer would then basically have the data disclosed to them and they could get help. And the children could say no. And then it came back and said, if they said no, it gave them a second chance and said, the investigator at the University of North Carolina can get some help for you. Would you like to have that person get help for you? And if they said no a second time, the data were encrypted and we never generated a report. We had a certificate of confidentiality from the federal government that allowed us to duck making an official report of child abuse. With a couple of exceptions, if there's current ongoing sexual abuse, the IRBs would not let us duck that one. Or if a child was reporting severe physical abuse currently, not past, if it was more than a year, we asked about it, but that didn't trigger it. But if it was current sexual abuse or current physical abuse that sounded severe, the children were not allowed to duck out of the questions and get help. And then the third thing that we changed was suicidal ideation. If the child had suicidal ideation, then that was called to the attention of the interviewer. And so other than that, every other form of abuse. And I can tell you that no child wanted the information shared. That when given the choices, no child expected the information to be, or wanted the information shared, that when given the choice. Which was really interesting to us. That they were willing to tell us about it, but they weren't interested in getting help from our interviewers. So we used official reports, we used self-reports, and then we also were interested in kind of other exposure. So we used a life event scale that kind of collected harm from other people and neighborhood violence. And then we also asked about witnessing domestic violence. And we also asked the parents about domestic violence so that we had that. Interestingly, the parents often told us, yeah, there's domestic violence, but the kids don't know about it. The kids all knew about it too. And then we had the other problem is we were in 5 states, and the state laws differ in different states. And how are we going to code, and how are we going to deal with it? And we made a decision that for official reports, we were not going to use the official report the way they did it. We set a protocol for how to read the official reports and read the narratives, and then they got recoded by research classifications. And we used the modified maltreatment classification system of Barnett and Cicchetti. And so, so we looked. We had research definitions for what was physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, and moral, legal, and educational neglect that we used from Barnett, Manley, and Cicchetti. And then the physical abuse was classified into 9 subtypes and included data about where that physical abuse happened. Neglect was separated into failure to provide and lack of supervision. And emotional abuse, we had a variety of subtypes that we looked at to clarify. So we had a coding system. We used vignettes from histories obtained from children that we did on videotape, and then all our interviewers were trained in the coding system, and we filled in Barnett, Manley, Cicchetti. You code the type of abuse and you code the severity, and 5 or 6 is hospitalization or death, and 1 is no marks and no residual. And in the original coding system, you got to fill in what scale it was beyond the best and worst, but we actually ended up finding that we couldn't get people to be reliable about severity scoring without giving them more information, so we developed some in-between scores. for the severity. And so each of them had, for example, this is the physical abuse severity. So severity 1 was no marks indicated, 2 was minor marks, numerous or non-minor marks. Severity 4 was that they'd been taken to the emergency room or medical treatment. Severity 5, hospitalization for more than 24 hours. And 6 was permanent disability or death. But we did that for each form of abuse, had its own set of severity codes that people were trained to use. So this is what LONGSCAN looked like in terms of, these are allegations. So remember, 1,354 kids, and this is all allegations in the first 4 years of life, almost 4,500 allegations, of which neglect was more than half of them, and this is emotional maltreatment. And I should add that social services almost never codes emotional maltreatment, but we reclassified from the about 5% emotional maltreatment. It's about 38% of the cases had emotional maltreatment by using our research criteria. And you can see that by 4 and 6, the numbers were much smaller in that epoch, and then as you go down, neglect and physical abuse really declined in terms of frequency. And in our sample, sexual abuse didn't go up, and normally sexual abuse is more common in early teenage years and going up. It turns out that LONGSCAN kids, despite being a high-risk sample, have a lower than expected lifetime experience with sexual abuse compared to a normative population in the US, which is an interesting observation. That my only explanation I have is these kids had been known to the child welfare system since the first 4 years of life, and there's lots of scrutiny, and it may be that one of the side effects of that and one benefit of being involved in child welfare is that they were then subjected to less sexual abuse. Yeah. Although the self-report data for disclosing other things, I'll show you what they disclosed, because they did disclose a bunch of things to us. So I have some graphs to show you that, because they told us about a lot of sexual abuse. It's just that relative to the normative population of Americans, that they were actually looked a little safer. Okay, so this was allegations, and this is abuse. Substantiations, and so less than half the kids were substantiated, and you can see that the numbers come down dramatically, and so we're now talking about a scale of less than 2,000 instead of over 4,000. And for physical and sexual abuse, we're talking pretty small numbers along the way. One of the papers out of LONGSCAN, I won't go into it, is that the long-term consequences psychologically for the kids who were substantiated versus the kids who were alleged don't look any different. And they both look different from the normative population. So we have a paper out called "It's a Distinction Without a Difference." And we basically, subsequently, in all our analyses of LONGSCAN, we use allegations and not substantiations as our marker for who is abused and neglected, because that appears to be more useful in terms of how it performs with the kids. So this was kind of just to kind of give you a sense of the numbers of allegations, and see if I can take you through this. So what this is showing you, we did the allegations by severity, birth to age 18, cross-site. So these are the types of allegations. Severity 1 or 2 code, severity 3 code, severity 4 and 5 code. So for physical abuse, most of the allegations were low severity. For sexual abuse, most of the allegations were high severity. And that involved penetration as opposed to just exposure or touching. And neglect, most of these were low substantiated. So not too surprising when you think about it, but an interesting thing for how you decide what's going on with children. Do you use severity to decide what the worst thing is for children, or do you use the different types of abuse, or how do you do it? So, but collectively overall, 60% of the maltreatment allegations that came through were for low severity events. And so maybe we should be discarding those and only focusing on high severity events. I mean, those are questions, empirical questions that we're looking at. But collectively, 6,000 allegations by age 18 on the sample. So lots and lots of allegations. These kids were frequent flyers in the system. And then emotional maltreatment was, social services almost never classified the kids directly emotional maltreatment. But we had a set of research criteria that, as we read through the narrative, if there were evidence of psychological harm, they could be recoded. And so, and we had some subcategories in terms of psychological safety, acceptance and self-esteem, age-appropriate autonomy, restrictive binding. And you can see that in terms of the characteristics that psychological safety, threats to psychological safety were the most common. And acceptance and self-esteem, and then restrictive binding and age-appropriate autonomy were smaller kinds of complaints.
How do you define psychological safety?
I wish I could remember the scale. It was we had a long and extensive discussion about which of the items and how to describe, but it was a classification of a subset of the Barnett-Manley-Cicchetti coding for psychological maltreatment that we classified as psychological safety. Threats of abandonment and kicking out of the home would have come under that category. Oh, in fact, here it is. Fear and intimidation. I'd forgotten that I had in the next slide. Threat to injure. Threatened suicide. If an adult threatened suicide, we regard that as emotional maltreatment. Beg pardon?
Serious stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
An abandoning child for more than 24 hours, attempts homicide in front of a child, attempts suicide. So those were the kinds of allegations that we coded. And what's interesting is there were a lot of those, and yet social services never classified anything as emotional maltreatment. So we took this as a pretty serious set of categories. They had offered services you couldn't classify as emotional maltreatment by law. So there were some, our research criteria caught something different from what the social services dealt with. So in terms of maltreatment, the majority of allegations of substantiations had already occurred by age 6. There was a fair amount of variation. The majority of physical abuse was low severity. Majority of sexual abuse was molestation, penetration. Majority of all allegations of neglect, but they were relatively low risk in the failure to provide and varied risk for lack of supervision issues. So I'm going to compare what the kids told us now to what social services knew about to give you kind of a picture of that. So these are the kids telling us self-reporting maltreatment. We asked them at the time, we told them at age 12, and then again at age 16 we interviewed them, and again, and the 16 interview was interval period between 12 and 16, and then at 18 we asked them lifetime again. And so at age 12, this is for physical abuse, the numbers was about 13% told us they'd been physically abused before elementary school. Since elementary school it was closer to 18%. In the last year, it was again roughly 11%, I think. And birth to age 12, lifetime, it was about 24% of the kids told us about physical abuse. At age 16, this was the interval period, again, almost a quarter of the kids told us about physical abuse that had happened since age 12. So these were numbers, and remember the curve, very few official allegations after age 6, and yet the kids were telling us about a lot of physical abuse that happened between 12 and 16. But pardon? No, this didn't include spanking. This is harsher. Same kids, yes. I'm sorry, yes. I will show you another graph that shows that a little bit. But it's basically the same kids who were telling it earlier. And then at age 18, we get a little bit different picture because at age 18, the last year was much smaller. These are bigger kids. But when we asked about the interval that kind of captured where this was going, this was up here at 25. Now it's down at about 14%. So why is that different and why are they reflecting it? It's just what it is. But on the other hand, if we summarize at 18 in our sample, it was over 40% of the children reported lifetime physical abuse. So a little bit different picture. And a couple other things. Early on at age 12, a lot of kids told us about before elementary school. When they were 18, the kind of early years were not as well represented. Obviously, time heals wounds. So this is the concordance slide. And birth to age 12, 69% of the kids agreed that there had been no physical abuse. and this agreement, no physical abuse, and blue is agreement that abuse occurred. Only 4.5% of the kids told us that abuse had occurred, that DSS knew abuse had occurred. There was, the yellow was 7.8% didn't disclose physical abuse despite the fact that they had a DSS record showing that they'd been physically abused. Maybe that would happen when they were very young. But new reports, 18.5% of them told us about physical abuse that it was never in the records. So demonstrating how complicated it is to do a longitudinal study on the consequences of child abuse and neglect if you're only using official reports, because you're really capturing only a small part of what's happened. And actually the other thing that's interesting is the consistent in these two of the kids not disclosing, despite the fact social services said that they'd been physically abused. And some of that may have been very young children and they've just lost the memory of it. In terms of sexual abuse, the scale is different. So you can see that we're now up to 18% is the top on this scale, just to kind of, so that sexual abuse is much less common. But birth to 18 and overall cohort, just to compare to David Finkelhor and other people's work suggesting that something on the order of 15% of men and 25% of women had been sexually abused when they were children. At age 18 in our sample, birth to 18, the number was about 7.5% of the kids having reported that they'd been sexually abused lifetime. Which is, so that was hence my comment that our kids seem to have lower than overall rates from other surveys of population, which is a little hard to explain. But at age 12, just to complicate things a little further, they told us about 16% of them reported that they'd been sexually victimized. But at age 18, it was only 7%. So trying to put that all together, it kind of depends, doesn't it? It's sobering about kind of...
They choose to forget.
Well, it may very well be the kids who no longer remember and to put it behind them, and or they suppress the memories, and so the issues of recovered memories come to mind in terms of what that all means. So there are lots of potential things to think about, but it is sobering that it's so different depending on when you ask folks. And this is the concordance in the sexual abuse rates. And the good news is most kids weren't sexually abused and didn't say they were sexually abused in both of these groups. But a new report that the kids told us about is the green. And in both age groups, there were more kids telling us about being sexually abused that they told about than social services knew about. In each case, it was so any study of the long-term consequences of sexual abuse that relied on official reports would capture less than half of the kids who had been sexually abused. Yes?
In order to, when social services made up the official reports, I'm sure you asked the children.
Well, that's the interesting assumption you just made, and it turns out that when a child comes in labeled as physical abuse, many workers do not ask about sexual abuse or other things. They kind of narrow in on the complaint and go after it, and there's not the same kind of process of investigating. And it turns out that we all have this myopia of, they came in labeled as exposed to domestic violence, or they came in exposed to sexual abuse, and nobody ever asks them about the other forms of maltreatment.
So if they would screen the children differently, they might have come up.
Right. So one of the potential take-home lessons from our work is actually that there probably ought to be a systematic protocol for asking by child protective workers that goes beyond, that asks about all the forms of trauma that the child might have gotten, and not just the call that came in reported a child being physically abused or sexually abused. And everybody kind of puts on their blinders and charges ahead, helping with that. And there needs to be systematic data collection about other forms of trauma. And then for psychological maltreatment, this one is interesting. The scale goes back up. This is 45%. We asked the children at age 12, and we had 12 different questions about psychological trauma, including being called names or threatened abandonment or locked out of the home and that kind of thing. Birth to age 12, 40% of the children reported that. And you can imagine that social services knew nothing like that. And interestingly, teenagers being teenagers, almost 35% of them reported between 12 and 16 that they'd been victims of psychological trauma. And you'll remember the curve about very few complaints to social services after age 6. And then lifetime, birth to 18, the kids at 18 told us about, still a little bit smaller number, but still over 35% of the kids reported psychological maltreatment. So they didn't forget it as much, or else it was continuing enough that they could remember the recent stuff and not the past stuff.
How could you measure the severity of the psychological abuse?
We had a combination of a series of questions that our psychologist developed in asking about abandonment and threatened suicide. You saw some of the items, and then we actually didn't do the severity as easily because it was a little harder to come up with. We had severity for the things that were in official reports. We didn't have severity for the self-report piece. Yes?
I think most of the questions in the questionnaires are objective questions. Did this happen? This situation occurred? Did you have any questions of subjective assessment of the child? Do you think you have gone through sexual abuse? Do you think you've gone through?
We actually never used the word abuse with them. We asked about behaviors and parent. So no, we didn't do it quite that way. But we asked about anybody threaten suicide in front of you or call you names. So we tried to be very behavioral in terms of actual behaviors that happen. And so this is the, again, the concordance here, and the numbers are much smaller. You can see in the first half the children agreed that they hadn't been, but the other half, either social services, the child, or both told us that they'd been emotionally, psychologically maltreated early on, and the numbers aren't very different at age 18. But in both cases, the green, which is the new reports to us, far outweigh the number that social services ever knew about. And then there's the other interesting question of what do you do with the yellow, which is the kid didn't tell us about it, but social services record had it in it, in terms of how to classify those. But you can see that any study looking at the consequences of child maltreatment that doesn't ask the child what they happen would clearly, and our colleagues who beat up on us about the fact that we needed to stop being chicken and ask the kids were right, that we would have missed major levels of exposure if we had just used social services records, which was our original naive plan as we did our longitudinal study. The other question you're going to ask is, well, what happened when you did report? Because we did report cases that were either the current sexual abuse or current physical abuse that was severe. And those families actually stayed in the study better than the other. Proportionally, we had better retention of those families than the ones who didn't. So we didn't actually find that reporting families, they left the study. We didn't, which we thought was interesting. And I think the reason for that is that we dealt with a population largely who had already dealt with social services many times. There was experience with that. And as I joked, those guys, telling them that you're going to report them to social services doesn't cause them any fear because they've been there, done that, and have the T-shirt already. And so they kind of know that system, and it just doesn't bear any threat for them. The families that freak out about threats of reporting child abuse and neglect are the middle-class families that have never dealt with it because they can imagine that their teenager or young child will say something that will get them in trouble, and just because they think about how mouthy their kids are. But in fact, the child welfare population doesn't worry much about these things. So then the next set of slides includes descriptive statistics for the self-report data limited to children who have data at 3 time points. But I just want to share with you, these are the kids reporting physical abuse at all 3 time points. We've got interviews at 12, 16, and 18. And these are the physical abuse, smaller end here. And the physical abuse before preschool was in the 12% range, since elementary school, 15% range. In the interval between 12 and 16, up over 20%, and at age 18, in the interval period from 16, it should be, at age 18, in the last year is pretty small. And then for sexual abuse, similarly. And then I'm going to go, okay, so this is self-reported neglect. We use the mean scores. Let's see if I can describe this. This is one of my colleagues that did this. I have to get back and take a look at it. Sorry. We had, these are the issues of the kind of neglect issues that people were describing. And we had a scale at the side that was the number of, this was the number of items in each of these areas. So basic, failure to provide basic needs, emotional support, physical needs, and monitoring supervision. And we were looking to compare boys and girls. And the conclusion here ultimately is that girls had more neglect in terms of emotional support, more neglect in terms of monitoring supervision, more neglect in terms of physical needs, and more neglect in terms of basic needs with relatively, and then the differences weren't quite so dramatic later on. We looked at life events and family stress, and where I'm going with all this is we included a lot of information about family transitions, brothers and sisters born, families, divorces, extended parental absence. We used death, serious illness, legal system environment, and we had some positive things like graduating from formal schooling, but a collection of a variety of things on our life event scale. And this is the mean number of stressful life events in the preceding 12 months at each assessment. And the ends are different because we collected data at different points. But what's interesting about this is the number of stressful life events these children had was more than 4, almost 5. Went down a little bit down to age 12, and then in the teenage years was back up. But we're talking 4 to 5 life stress events for each of the kids.
What would, on the list, what would have been the least stressful? I mean, just to see what the bottom of the scale, the entry point of the scale, what would be the least significant?
So we counted the number of events that were happening, and there are some things like a brother sister born that might not have been terribly stressful, but we counted exposure to loud long argument, witnessing murder, witnessing sexual abuse. Those were stressful life events. Yeah, so it was a long list, and they had lots of opportunities to get stressful events. But these kids, I mean, all collectively had lots of stress life.
But it could have been that even some of the kids who got 5 stressful events, all of them were less traumatic stressful events, like having
a brother. Yeah, right. As opposed to
it's not that it's coming from different.
yeah, it's the metric. The metric gets kind of tough to try and do that and figure that.
The stress of the stressful events.
Exactly. We didn't go into a stress score.
Yeah.
So this is the mean number of stressful life events in the preceding 12 months and the mean cumulative number of stressful life events at each assessment. And so this is in the preceding 12 months, and this is the cumulative number of life events. And so what's interesting is how clearly the step is to the point that at age 15 that we're averaging 56 stressful life events. So the annual number is here, but these are kids who are having lots of stuff happen and lots of transitions, lots of changes.
Life
Wasn't smooth. And were there certain types of life stress events that were more common at different ages? My colleague tried to figure out. Turns out exposure to loud, long arguments happens all the way across. Family moves happens mostly in younger ages, but a few times here. Extended parental absence was really a risk for very young children. Serious accident or illness, kind of middle group. Changing schools for teenage years. So they're a little bit different by age. And so a multiple regression of CBCL scale scores on cumulative life events is a model that one of my colleagues did here and concluded. And so family transitions was not statistically significantly related to internalizing score. Family stress was. Exposure to violence was. These two were the strongest relationship. And family transitions, legal justice involvement, and neutral positive things all didn't seem to have. So the CBC internalizing score at age 14 was clearly these two things, family stress and exposure to violence, were the things that related to it. Intimate partner violence aggression we measured by self-report of the female caregiver at age 6. And there was a sample of 554 female caregivers that reported having a current intimate partner. And of those 554, any perpetration of domestic violence was 452. So there was a lot of domestic violence in this group. Bilateral was 78% of it, meaning that the parent on the conflict tactics scale, the mother was hitting the father and the father was hitting the mother. I mean, it was both directions. There was only 24 in which the perpetration was by the male only, and there were 77 that the perpetration was by the female only. So there's actually more violence on the intimate partner violence conflict tactics scale, which actually parallels the studies we've done in other places, that there's actually, in defense of the women, it may be that some of it's reactive, that they had a verbal threat and they did a physical response. But actually, we see that over and over again in surveys, that the intimate partner violence scale of physically hitting is actually slightly 1 or 2% more common among females than males. And there were only 102 households in this sample that had no intimate partner violence. And then we tried so in terms of describing the prevalence, 82% of the male perpetrator, there was verbal aggression, 82.7%, 93.6%. So females actually did more verbal aggression, and females did more minor aggression, and actually did more severe aggression. So interestingly, beg pardon? Sounds right. I don't turn this into a battle of genders, but what's interesting is that I sat on a panel judging grants for the National Institute of Justice a number of years ago, and there were some domestic violence researchers there that were very offended by the idea that one would consider female perpetrated violence in this, and thought that that was missing the point and that they shouldn't fund studies that looked at female perpetrated violence. And my colleague who put this analysis together is Diana English, and she basically wants to make the point that children who come into the child welfare system, it's rarely just male perpetrated intimate partner violence, and that constellation of violence in the home is something that goes both ways and may have much more implications for the children. I'm going to jump right, what I want to go to here is the final point that I was going to make is the Secretary General study of children and violence suggested that global disease that can be attributed to child sexual abuse, 7 to 8% of all depression, alcohol, and drug abuse in the world. The Secretary General of the UN study suggests that 7 to 8% is attributed to child sexual abuse, and that for males it's 4 to 5%, and that suicide and panic disorders. This is by way of saying that a lot of people, if you look in the literature, suggest that child sexual abuse is the worst thing that can happen to kids. But the problem with that research base is there's been very little prospective research like we've done on LONGSCAN, going from exposure to outcome. The Secretary General study looked at outcomes and then attributed them backwards to sexual abuse. There have been relatively few prospective studies of child abuse, and overall, the first one that I know of that was published was Betty Elmer's study in 1967, and she concluded that children exposed to poverty looked just as bad as the children exposed to child abuse, and that child abuse didn't confer an extra burden, that poverty was such a strong burden on the kids in Pittsburgh. Most studies subsequently have been short or cross-sectional retrospective. In fact, even the longitudinal Christchurch study wouldn't ask about child abuse until they were all adults, because they were worried about losing their sample. And so they asked retrospectively about child sexual abuse and physical abuse when the kids were in the 20s. And so, and I've gone through how we've measured with the review of social services records and asking the children directly. For physical abuse, we used the combination of CPS reports, allegations, substantiations, the self-report, and there are 18 items. Has an adult caretaker ever, and then a variety of questions like hit you with something really dangerous like a bat or a shovel, kicked, punched, bitten, tried to choke, drown, or smother you, And then we clarified whether it was before or after elementary school, in the last year, the number of times, and who did it.
Is there an ongoing administrative system that's used? It's not your, or
This is our system. This is the LONGSCAN self-report. We used a combination of CPS reports and LONGSCAN together to decide who has been exposed. So we use Boolean logic. If CPS said you've been physically abused, we counted it. If the kid said they'd been physically abused, they counted it. So if the kid said they hadn't been and the CPS said they had, we counted them as having been. And for sexual abuse, we did a similar kind of process. We used the, in addition to the CPS, we had the ACASI self-reports. There were 11 questions in that. Questions like, have you anybody ever touched your private parts or bottom in some way? Has ever gotten you to touch their private parts? And then clarified when it happened. And we classified the child report in terms of either non-contact sexual abuse, fondling, oral genital, or penetration. For psychological maltreatment, we reviewed Child Protective Service reports. And then at age 12, we also asked, using the project developed instrument that looked at humiliation, shame, cursing, and other hurtful events like threatened abandonment. We coded the Child Protective Service reports using the Barnett-Manley-Giacchetti system. We established 90% reliability in terms of coding. And the number of psychological maltreatment allegations through age 12, the mean was 0.79 with standard deviation of 1.53. 34% of the kids in this sample, a subset that we analyzed, had at least one psychological maltreatment allegation. For psychological maltreatment, there were 18 questions that we asked them. We summed them to create a psychological maltreatment score. The mean was 1.2, standard deviation 2.2. 40% of the kids endorsed psychological maltreatment themselves. And these were, just to give you some item, psychological stress. Has any caregiver ever blamed you for their own problems, called you names, or teased you, made you feel really bad about yourself? Ever made you feel you couldn't do anything right no matter how hard you tried? Ever punished you in an unusual way, like tying you up or locking you in a closet? Ever made you feel like they didn't care whether you were safe or healthy? Ever threatened to hurt you badly? Ever threatened to kill you? Ever threatened to abandon or leave you forever? Ever threatened to kick you out of the home or have you taken away? So reasonably scary stuff for certainly most American kids. Not like the boogeyman like that. And then we looked at the outcomes at ages 6, 12, and 16 using the child behavior checklist on internalizing, externalizing, and total problems. And then we replicated it with the child self-report because these are parent report instruments. And we used the model of, we looked at all the kids who'd had who completed the age 6 exposure, by exposure to age 6, and then similarly, and so 13% of them had seen family violence, 21% at age 6 had been self-reported or DSS reported sexual abuse, 37% physical abuse, 76% of the sample was minority race, 51% female. The only analysis variable we had outcome for psychological was CBCL for every age group, so that's why I'm presenting it there. And we're predicting the CBCL problems, total problems, internalizing and externalizing. We're looking how race, gender, and maternal education predicted the scores, then we add witnessing domestic violence, and then we added the other forms of child abuse to see how they all compared. And just a word about regression analysis. Epidemiologists love regression. It kind of puts everything together. It loses all the data, forgives missing variables and small numbers of subjects. And the R-square is used as our approximation of the outcome explained. And the standardized beta gives the relative strength of each variable. So this was the overall distribution of clinical scores in the green over time. And interesting, despite the fact that I told you how bad the kids were doing developmentally and their low IQ, only about a fifth of the kids had externalizing scores, and it was really pretty stable over time. And internalizing, it was about 13, 14%. Total problems between about a fifth of the kids. So 75% of the kids at age 16 were doing okay in total problems. 81% were doing okay in internalizing, and 70% externalizing at outcome at age 18, which I thought was really interesting given what I told you they look like to begin with. So one take-home lesson is this group actually looks like it's done remarkably well considering what they look like at age when they came in. And so then we modeled the CBL score. I'm going to go through a series of models. We modeled the CBL scores now here at age 6, internalizing and externalizing. We controlled for race, but physical abuse, the standardized beta is 0.086, witness violence 0.06, and sexual abuse was not statistically significant in terms of predicting internalizing. So witness violence, physical abuse, and race made a difference in terms of who was internalizing. Externalizing, sexual abuse and psychological maltreatment were statistically significant, and the standardized betas were 0.12, 0.10. So they were actually stronger than the kind of numbers we got for the other two. But the adjusted R-square was pretty small, just 3% of the variance. For total problems, similarly, the standardized betas were actually a little bit stronger for sexual abuse and statistically significant, and psychological abuse 0.07. Where I'm going with this is then I'm going to show you for age 12, and we've highlighted the ones that seem to be really strong, and then yellow is a little bit is trend kind of stuff. And so psychological maltreatment at age 12 appeared to be one of the most important factors in terms of statistical significance and beta weight. And females were a little bit higher risk. For externalizing physical abuse, sexual abuse were comparable, and psychological maltreatment and witness violence was less important. So going back, witness violence for 6-year-olds was one of the things that shows up as important, but it doesn't show up at age 12. I'm sorry, the total problems. And it doesn't show up at age 12. So for younger kids, witnessing violence appears to be much more important than for older kids. But for this case, 12, psychological abuse really ends up showing up and appearing in the mix. And when you think developmentally what kids are going through, at age 6, your mother keeps you safe from the world. And witnessing domestic violence and suggesting that the household is dangerous and your mother's not safe seems to make a lot of sense to me that at age 6, witnessing domestic violence is at least as potent as the other forms of adverse experiences. At age 12, you're trying to figure out who you are and what your role is like, and that whole kind of self-identity. And so psychological maltreatment pops in as an important factor at age 12. And if we jump ahead, well, this is the total problems again. Psychological abuse ends up being very important in having the strongest of the standardized beta weights. This is psychological. This is total problem score at CBCL.
Psychological abuse of age 12?
I'm sorry, in the prior 4 years. Or 4 years. I'm sorry. So it's psychological maltreatment pops up as more important than sexual abuse in terms of standardized betas at age 12. And physical abuse pales in comparison to the other two, although it's close to significance. And at age 16, the picture changes again, in that physical abuse becomes the most prominent thing for internalizing and externalizing. And witnessed violence drops off, is no longer statistically significant, and the beta weights are much lower. And psychological abuse has dropped off again as well. So I'm presenting a picture where for the 6 and 8-year-olds, the witnessing domestic violence takes on a really important piece. And the physical and sexual abuse may be less important. At age 12, psychological maltreatment may be particularly destructive for children. And at age 16, and then we're also doing some 18 analysis, it looks like the physical abuse becomes more salient for the kids at that point. So that the take-home lesson is we need to think about the exposures in the context of developmental status of the children, and that they aren't all the same. And so when somebody tells you that sexual abuse is the worst thing that could happen to a child, or emotional maltreatment is the worst thing, or witnessing violence, it kind of depends on the child age. And we even though we work with different children all the time at different ages and think about that, we kind of try and lump all sexual abuse together and all physical abuse together and all witness violence together. This was the total problems. And interestingly, the witness for this is 16. The witness violence was not statistically significant, but the standardized beta was actually higher than the physical abuse was statistically significant and higher. But witness violence, and this is neighborhood crime, and kids are out and about, so that actually I could put that together in my conceptual model in my brain. We also were interested in, does this represent the caregiver as the person who does the CBCL? So we wanted to make sure that we weren't just looking at what adults think about their kids as opposed to what kids are actually going through. And so we used this youth self-report at age 12, and I just thought I'd share with you that the standardized beta for predicting total problem score in the youth self-report, what witness violence was very important at age 12, physical abuse was important, but psychological abuse, the standardized beta was almost twice what it was for physical abuse or sexual abuse.
The YSS score is which variable?
This is the total score for the youth self-report. So this is the child behavior total problem score.
Number of problems.
It's the youth self-report is like the CBCL. There is a total problem score and a clinical range, and so these are so we're predicting the total problem score for the children at age 12. And so the conclusion here is witnessing community violence was important. Witnessing family violence wasn't important. Physical abuse, sexual abuse were both important, but psychological abuse at age 12, and it fit kind of where we were looking at with it confirmed the kind of parent report analysis that psychological maltreatment of 12-year-olds was a particularly salient issue. So in summary, the conventional wisdom holds that, and I hear this all the time, that sexual abuse is the worst thing that can happen to kids. And I think that's putting the adult lens on the problem. Because for younger kids, they don't know enough about sex to know what it is, and it's just weird stuff being done by an adult. But the witnessing their parent being maltreated or being denigrated and emotionally maltreated themselves may have very important issues for them at different developmental ages. You had a question?
Do you have any information on what services or interventions of children receive from social services?
No, not for this. I mean, we do, I shouldn't say that. LONGSCAN collects extensively, but it turns out to be a nightmare for coding because when you ask social workers what services, some social workers will say, I've given extensive counseling, and it's them talking, and other people don't count what they do, and only if they've referred to a mental health therapist. And so the measurement data for trying to figure out what's happened in social services and what kind of interventions is incredibly difficult to get. And we've struggled with that. We've finally gone to a yearly interview with the parents, asking them who the child's been referred to as the way to do it, which captures the ones that the parents are still accessible, but causes a big loss of numbers.
And that might explain that sexual abuse wasn't very significant, but maybe those children get more attention from the system.
Well, you're probably more optimistic about the evidence for getting services and having the services provided consistently, collectively for sexual abuse kids. I think, I mean, in truth, I think it depends on the age of the kids and so many other specific characteristics about an individual family that it's hard to generalize.
What's the percentage of reported sexual abuse? Higher than for other kinds of abuse?
No, it was actually lower.
Lower.
And I mean, overall, collectively, our kids had less sexual abuse than the general population of kids that age. I mean, and how to explain that? The only way I can come up with it is our kids were involved with social services from a very early age in most of the sites. And so there may have been more surveillance and more observation, and that's why our lifetime at age 18, the kids told us about 7% of them had been sexually victimized. And I can't think of a single retrospective survey of college or adults that has a 7% figure for childhood sexual abuse. That's usually for women, it's about 25%, 20 to 25%, and for men, it's 12 to 15%. So a 7% number is really remarkably low, for especially a pooled number for both men and women. So hence my conclusion that being in a research study on child abuse is good for you in terms of keeping you from being away from sexual abuse. Well, I can stop there and see if you have any other questions. I mean, I have lots more slides, but I've probably talked enough. So take-home lessons. coding is really complex when you're dealing with multiple jurisdictions, and when you're dealing with sampling and trying to do consistent training, and all the things that we learn about in grad school about how to do research really come to the fore when you do it. And the other part of one is when you're doing a longitudinal study, it's going to be part of your life for a very long time. And so you have to kind of decide that that's okay and that you don't have other questions, burning questions you need to go after, because this consumes most of my time and effort trying to find money and keep it going and sustaining it. And so you have to decide it's important enough that you want to stick with it. Any questions? I'm happy to. There are now about 25 doctoral dissertations that have been done using the data. The data actually are publicly available at the Cornell Child Abuse Data Archive. And so there are many people that have analyzed them in addition to our own papers and projects. The LONGSCAN website has our own papers and lists lots of the stuff we've done. We have done about 180 papers ourselves collectively over the years, and we've barely touched the data. It's just, I mean, we have 1,354 kids, probably 2,000 variables per kid or something, and a complex relational database. But it takes a little time to get used to the data and work with it.
I think we're in PST from so much exposure.
So the challenge for us was early on was that kind of how are you going to measure which kids are exposed, and it's. I don't know if we've captured all of it, but it's actually turned out to be a very complex story. It would have been a lot simpler if we just stuck to the Child Protective Services records.
I think what's amazing in this data regarding the assumption that children don't tell about what's going on with their lives, about the abusive consequences, and maybe what I'm getting from this data is that children do tell, but do they have someone to tell to? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, I think you can ask children and you will get the answers. You may not get all the answers. We ended up using a combination of allegations plus child self-report to classify which children have been exposed. But if we hadn't asked the children directly, we would, I think, be in serious trouble for trying to understand what was going on with them. Which makes it a lot harder because official data are a lot easier to get access to than trying
Maybe
to.
in the United States. I think we're in the opposite situation. Sometimes it's easier to ask children than to get the official data in Israel.
Well, and asking the children has the ethical issues of do children especially if you're going to make reports on the basis of what they told you, can children understand informed consent? Can they? Do they understand that if they tell you about it that they may go to foster care or their parents may be arrested and put in jail? And then there's some interesting questions that some of the IRBs have started to ask, which is, do you have to ask parents' consent to ask the children because of the implications for the parent in terms of ethics?
Yeah, and as their guardians, right.
Right, and so, I mean, we do ask, in the United States, we ask the parents, but our colleagues in other countries have felt that they could ask the children without asking the parents because they argue the Convention on the Rights of the Child means that you actually have the responsibility to not let children's stories be altered by caregivers' refusals to participate. And so it's an interesting juxtaposition of right, so they do surveys at school, and then how do you respond in that situation? Or they do surveys at camps or in other settings where children are at. But then how do you respond if you do have a report, if they're given in that situation where the parents didn't give informed consent? Yes?
Yeah, we're all kind of post-traumatized. I agree.
Sorry.
So much.
Too much data.
So we'll try to stick with these kind of more technical things, which are actually though very fundamental. Because, for instance, the issue of informed consent that you were saying before, I'm thinking, how does that mean? You told people up front, what you tell me, I will have to report. Is basically what you're saying, and it didn't affect their willingness to be in the study.
The families actually, it was the families who we made reports on stayed in the study better than the families who didn't. which is, I think, reflects the fact that we were dealing with a child welfare sample. I think if we had done this in a different sample, in a middle-class families that had never dealt with child welfare before, it would be a very different answer. I think that we would have scared a lot of people away just getting informed consent. They would have said, I'm not going to participate.
Right, because you were telling me before about the study where you went anonymous in order not to have to ask for consent.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, in the general population, we did anonymous so that we wouldn't have to report anybody who had told us that something had happened to them. And we thought that we had a compelling public health need to know how much is really going on, and thought that the biases that might happen if we got informed consent and reported people would be such that that data would not be useful for public policy perspective.
I have another question. I mean, the questions are very harsh to the children, and I'm wondering, like, did you, what would you say, like, couch it, soften it, like, add other questions on the side?
This was in the context of close to a 2-hour interview by the time they were 14 or 16. So it was just, and they were used to us. They've seen us many times, and the psychological maltreatment and the child abuse questions were asked within earphones, so it was very private. So it was presented as, now we're going to move to the part of the interview that we're asking about experiences you may have had, and then the assurances in terms of disclosure that are all part of that informed consent, and then they move to that section of the interview. But we actually did the whole interview by audio Cassie by the time they were 14 and 16.
The whole thing?
The whole thing was by earphones for the kids.
By the way, can you do telephone interviews with children?
David Finkelhor has done telephone interviews with children and gotten on the National Family Violence, no, not that, what do you call it? He used the JVQ, the Juvenile Victimization Questionnaire, in a national sample, and got parents' permission, and then had the parents put the kids on and ask the kids directly about their maltreatment experiences on that sample, and succeeded in doing it. I had some interesting, I thought, how do you get that, how'd that work? Have you done that here?
We've interviewed youth from, from 12, but we didn't ask about maltreatment.
12 to 18.
12 to 18, yeah.
But we did ask
immigrant-
about risk behaviors.
Yeah, risk behaviors, not specific
Risk behaviors,
maltreatment.
relationships with parents.
David asked about sexual victimization, physical victimization of kids, and bullying by siblings and peers, all as part of his juvenile victimization questionnaire.
Bullying, risk behavior.
We've done that.
And were his results comparable to other surveys that used either questionnaires or
Actually, nobody, he did a general sample of the population, and I don't think anybody else in the U.S. has ever done it quite that way, so I don't think there's anything quite comparable. He and I had this discussion because his survey instrument was so sensitive that, if somebody said a cross word to you, you potentially could respond to it in terms of bullying or psychological maltreatment. And so the metric of severity was as I read his paper, I said, you're telling me that 80% of kids are maltreated or victimized or exposure to violence, but is that a real number in the sense of how, is that overly sensitive and worrying about everybody, and is that capturing major things, or are you making equivalent minor versions of violence and putting them equivalent?
What's your own feeling about telephone interviews with youth, about this, about abuse?
I haven't done it, I mean, quite frankly, and I think that the ethical issues of potentially putting kids at risk for asking them with their parents in the home, saying we're going to ask questions, and then you can't control the situation, and you may in fact have, what did you tell them about what happened last year or something, and getting the kid beat up again because they might have disclosed something. So I worry about that situation and think that it's probably better to do anonymous surveys in the school with a questionnaire and just debrief everybody than it is to do a telephone survey, in my own view. But
we could ask David. He will be our guest next year. Okay. So keep the question. We could ask him.
You have a lot of trust in my memory. Okay.
No, I have enough trust in Miriam.
I'm writing it down.
Anyone else have a question? Don't be bashful.
well, I've thrown a lot of stuff at you, and I'm happy to respond after here if you've got questions. I mean,
So one quick question. You mentioned something about poverty, not in some studies, not necessarily being a predictor, but you did say, it seems to me, that low education was a high predictor.
Mother's low education in the international comparisons was a very high predictor.
So that's linked to poverty.
But in our most recent survey in the United States, looking at rates of harsh discipline, I was surprised to find no relationship between socioeconomic status.
That's amazing.
And it was the first study that I know of that didn't find that. And we tortured the data a lot to see if we could find if it was hiding in there somewhere. We couldn't tease out that, because I was actually quite surprised and a little skeptical that we wouldn't find a socioeconomic relationship. And we wondered whether we had done the classifications of income wrong, or I mean, and that may be the explanation, is that we.
But that means when you say low socioeconomic, you mean income. But in that same study, education did make a difference, although income didn't.
In that study, we didn't ask both. We didn't. We only asked income. We didn't ask education. So I can't answer that one for you.
Okay.
In our other studies internationally, years of education clearly predicts.
Yeah.
Leading to my overall conclusion that if the world wants to reduce violence against kids, we need to take care of girls and get them educated. That might be the single best strategy for worldwide reduction in violence, would be to educate girls and make sure that they, and I guess the second part of that goes,
So
not having,
violent.
they'll be less violent, and and it may also be that, and they have children at an older age is the other piece of it. So delaying childbearing and finishing school together probably results in a kinder, gentler world.
Delaying childbearing after age 18.
Right. So it's a compelling reason why we ought to pay attention to the state of girls for the world, and trying to make sure that they're not forced into early marriages and deprived of education.
Well, among Arab young women, girls in high school in Israel, we have a 20% Arab population. In Israel, the high school, not only completion, but the high school matriculation, like passing and your SATs, something like that. The SATs is today twice as high for girls as it is for boys.
Well, it's actually happening in the United States as well, that we're talking about lost boys because the girls are surpassing in education. Yeah. But unfortunately, the rest of the world isn't quite there either. So. Well, I've given you lots of information and kind of probably overwhelmed you, and probably not in your native language, so the combination has made it. But I'm happy to respond to emails or questions, and some people like Guy are going to come over and hang out with us at the Kemp Center, and if others of you find ways or opportunities to come by Denver, I'll be glad to welcome you there.
Thank you.